Hello and welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director of the Orchestre Nationale de Lille and the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive in to this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Paul, Taylor, and Chris, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. I am in Cologne this week with the amazing Gürzenich Symphony Orchestra, doing Dvorak's 7th Symphony, Pavel Haas's Study for Strings, and Bartók's Second Violin Concerto with the legendary Midori. Can't really think of a program that I would appeal to myself more, and I've really had such a wonderful time with the orchestra this week. For this week's episode, I realized I actually ran out of time with the American series because this is an episode that I've been wanting to put out for a long time. This was an episode I made actually in 2020, before the 2020 election, on political classical music. And I wanted to put it out before this year's election because I took a little bit of heat from some listeners about doing this fundraiser last month, and I really get that. It's a very heated, polarized time in the United States and really all over the world, and a lot of people just wanted a break from talking about politics, hearing about politics, especially contemporary modern politics. And again, I really understand that. I tried to sort of address that by not talking about the fundraiser at all on the show after we did it, and also really not mentioning it much during the show. But again, I really do understand that, and I take that very seriously. But with that said, I did want to explore political music because it's not really well known, but classical music actually has a long history of composers and performers involving themselves in the politics of the time. And so this episode is a kind of an attempt to explore all of that. Maybe not all of it, many of the examples of politics in classical music. And some of the pieces that I chose are quite relevant to today's debates. Some of them have nothing to do with them, and it's just an interesting historical curiosity. And the best part of all of this, of course, is that you get to hear a lot of really beautiful music along the way. I learned a lot from making this episode 4 years ago, a lot of pieces I actually had never heard before, and I hope you do too. And again, if you're American, I hope that you are standing in line to vote as you listen to this, or that you are going to be voting soon, or in the best case, that you've already voted. Thanks so much, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. I wanted to put this show out a couple of days early this week for Election Day in the US. First things first, if you're American, I hope you're listening to this while standing in line to vote. Now, Western classical music does not have the reputation for political activism that other kinds of music have. We never had a classical music Woodstock. But that doesn't mean composers haven't made political statements all throughout history with their music. The thing is, classical composers have often relied on people in power in order to be successful. Composers from the classical era were always looking for new patrons to assist them. Composers in the recent past relied on commissions, and still do. And performers rely on finding an audience that will fill the hall and also will donate funds to the organization. This has put everybody in the classical music field in some challenging positions, where it is usually better to stay quiet than to speak up about any issue of importance, and more importantly, controversy. But when composers did write political music, sometimes they were protesting a specific act, some were addressing a social issue, many were anti-war, and some wrote highly charged expressions of nationalism. And perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the pieces on my list used voices to tell their story and to speak their mind. So today we'll go through some of the most politically charged pieces in Western classical music history, all the way from the music of Joseph Haydn, yes, that Haydn, to the music of today. We'll talk about how a politically active piece is constructed, and in some cases where a political motive was put on a piece after it was written. We'll also discuss the controversies these pieces created, including in some cases passionate protests against the piece itself ever being performed again. Of course, the main thing we'll talk about, the root of it all, is the music itself. All of this and more is coming up on Sticky Notes. One caveat before we begin today. I'm going to be telling these stories mostly from the point of view of the composer who wrote the piece. So this isn't meant as an endorsement or a repudiation of their views. This show is 99% nonpartisan and it will stay that way today. So let's go back in time. It's a piece I've talked about a bit before, but it's a perfect place to start, since many of the pieces later on are about quite intense and difficult topics, and this one is more of a great story about what a good guy Joseph Haydn was. It was 1772, and Haydn was employed by his patron, Prince Nicholas Esterhazy. Nicholas, as he did most summers, headed off to his castle in Hungary and took a group of musicians, plus Haydn, with him for entertainment. After a long summer season, the musicians and Haydn expected to be allowed to go home. But the prince decided he wanted to stay a bit longer and keep everybody with him to perform yet another new symphony. Unsurprisingly, no one was happy about this except for the prince. Perhaps this is why the symphony Haydn wrote begins this way. The musicians, unable to speak to the prince themselves, appealed to Haydn for help. In a brilliant touch, Haydn didn't go to the prince to complain about what he did, but instead he wrote his protest into the last movement of the new symphony the prince wanted so badly. The movement begins this way. It's a pretty typical Haydn storm and stress period symphony. It's dramatic, fiery in a minor key, and full of call and response. But as this movement gets going and seems to be heading towards its ending, Haydn suddenly stops in his tracks and begins a slow movement, something that was practically unprecedented for its time. This adagio has a special twist. One by one, Haydn removes parts from the score until there are only 2 violins left. This wasn't something just done musically. For the first performance, Haydn instructed his musicians to snuff out their candles when their line finished and to quietly walk off the stage. The poignancy and gentle protest of this ending moved the prince, and the next day he sent his grateful musicians, and Haydn, home. Let's move now to Haydn's good friend Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who never wrote a protest piece per se, but his masterpiece opera, My Desert Island Piece, The Marriage of Figaro, was certainly a comment on class mores during his time. The Marriage of Figaro is the product of an amazingly fruitful collaboration between Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte. The three da Ponte Mozart operas, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte, and The Marriage of Figaro, are probably in the top 10 operas ever for most opera lovers, though the text of Così fan tutte, as I talked about in my show about the full opera, is certainly controversial. For The Marriage of Figaro, Lorenzo da Ponte chose an already politically charged text, the French writer Pierre Beaumarchais' play of the same name as the opera. The story, very briefly, centers on Susanna and Figaro, who are servants of the Count Almaviva. They are about to be married, but the Count has his eye on Susanna and wants to exercise his feudal right to sleep with Susanna on her wedding night. Obviously, neither Figaro nor Susanna want this. They devise a complicated scheme to humiliate the Count, which involves his grief-stricken wife, who wants nothing more than to have her husband back. There are tons of class issues at play here, and when Beaumarchais first presented his play in 1778, King Louis XVI was shocked and offended and banned its production. Beaumarchais changed a few details, and Louis allowed the play to be performed, but only for the royal family. It was forbidden to be performed publicly. Perhaps Louis saw the class struggle that the play centered on. Some scholars go so far as to say that this was one of the many catalysts that would lead to the French Revolution. In any case, da Ponte adapted the text of the play for his libretto, and Mozart's music provides the perfect dose of energy and sarcasm that really sends the message of equality, understanding, and class struggle home. To show you how da Ponte and Mozart do this, I want to focus on the beginning of the opera, the first scene of Act 1, where Figaro is measuring their new marriage bed and Susanna is trying on her wedding bonnet. The two are the top servants to the Count and the Countess, respectively. This happy scene is marked by an argument. Figaro loves the room that they were given, since it is so close to the Count's chambers, and he knows he can be right there whenever the Count needs him. Understandably, Susanna is not thrilled about this, and reveals to Figaro that the Count wants to exercise the droit du seigneur, and even afterwards, she would never be able to escape him.
Se a caso, madame, la notte ti chiama, madame ti chiama, din din, din din, in due passi da quella puoi gir.
If perchance madam should call you at night, ding ding, in 2 steps from here you'd be there. And then when the time comes that my master wants me, dong dong, in 3 bounds I am ready to serve him.
Don don, in 3 salti lo vado a servir.
Likewise, some morning the dear little Count, ding ding, may send you some 3 miles away. Ding ding, dong dong, the devil may send him to my door, and behold in 3 steps.
Don don, don don, a mia porta il diavolo porta, ed ecco i 3 salti. Susanna pian pian, Susanna pian pian, Susanna pian pian.
Immediately, Figaro shushes her, but you heard the little sarcastic touches that Mozart uses to mark the libretto. The ding-ding is written with just a little roll of the eyes, and when Susanna tries to smarten Figaro up, the music turns to a minor key and becomes more agitated. Susanna is being remarkably open with her fiancé about the problem. When she finally convinces Figaro that this is something real and to take seriously, he sings one of the more famous arias in the whole opera, where he says that if the Count wants to dance with him, he will dance right back.
Ballare, signor Contino, se vuol ballare, signor Contino, il chitarrino le suonerò, il chitarrino le suonerò, sì, le suonerò, sì, le suonerò.
If you would dance, my pretty Count, I'll play the tune on my little guitar. If you will come to my dancing school, I'll gladly teach you. I'll know how, but soft, every dark secret I'll discover better by pretending, sharpening my skill and using it, pricking with this one, playing with that one, all of your schemes I'll turn inside out.
Insegnerò sì, ingegnero. Saprò, 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 ma piano.
There is an undisguised anger and rage in Figaro here that shows both the unfairness of the situation and also his determination to make sure it doesn't happen. All of what I just described to you takes place within the first 10 to 15 minutes of the opera. The class struggle, the inequality, and the unfairness that Mozart and Da Ponte, through Beaumarchais, set up is the whole frame on which the opera is based. It's no wonder that the Austrian government, like Louis XVI, wasn't so happy with Mozart's opera either. I don't think it's a coincidence that the opera was premiered in 1786 with the French Revolution looming. Da Ponte and Mozart were surely putting their fingers on the social and political pulse of the time. Let's move forward a bit now to a brief example from Italy, Verdi's Va Pensiero. Like most of Europe, Italy as a country looks very different now than it did in the mid-1840s. In fact, modern-day Italy was a set of nation-states, controlled mostly by the Austrian Empire. Through a long and complicated series of skirmishes, negotiations, and all-out wars, Italy was fully unified by 1870. Now, that's a whole history course in 3 sentences, so I highly recommend reading about this topic in more detail on your own time. But how does Verdi fit into this? He was certainly a nationalist who believed in Italian reunification, and the chorus of the Hebrew slaves from his opera Nabucco, written in 1842, has always been seen as Verdi's expression of nationalistic spirit. In fact, it's widely believed that Verdi intended it as a sort of new national anthem for patriots and revolutionaries and proponents of reunification. The words bear this out. Go, on wings of gold, go settle upon the slopes and the hills where soft and mild the sweet airs of our native land smell fragrant. Greet the banks of the Jordan and Zion's toppled towers. O my country so beautiful and lost, O remembrance so dear and so fatal. Golden harp of the prophetic seers, why dost thou hang mute upon the willow? Rekindle our bosom's memories and speak to us of times gone by. Either akin to the fate of Jerusalem, give forth the sound of crude lamentation, or let the Lord inspire you a harmony of voices which may instill virtue to suffering. While of course the words here refer to Hebrew slaves, many people took them to be an allegory for the Italians who felt that without reunification, that they had no true home. And Verdi encouraged this idea, especially once Italian reunification was achieved. But there isn't actually a lot of evidence that it inspired a hugely patriotic fervor at its premiere, and plenty of scholars have posited that it actually wasn't taken as a revolutionary or nationalistic statement at all. This is an interesting idea that we'll come back to with one of the later pieces on my list, how a piece takes on a reputation long after the fact. Once Italian unification had been achieved, it wasn't without its problems. There was obviously a need to find national figures that could represent the country as a whole, and Verdi, as a world-famous composer, was one of those people. It fits, then, that this expression of nationalism from 20 years earlier would be a perfect way to represent this. Now, it's certainly possible that Verdi, who was a fervent believer in unification, meant Va Pensiero to be an expression of nationalism and protest, not only after reunification, but at the time that he wrote the piece, but we really can't be sure. Va Pensiero has been used in nationalistic campaigns in Italy since reunification, though, including sadly by people like Mussolini. In the more recent past, it was proposed to be the national anthem of Italy, but despite the idea being approved of by the then president of Italy, it never happened. Now, one piece we can be sure about in its nationalistic fervor and intent is Sibelius's Finlandia. Finlandia is a simple story. It was part of a suite written to celebrate Finland's past and to protest the censorship quietly from the Russian Empire, which from 1809 and until 1917 controlled Finland. Finland was autonomous, but Russia had recently attempted to take more control, passing a law that required Finnish soldiers to defend Russian territory anywhere in the empire, not only in Finland. They also increased censorship of the media and of Finnish nationalism. Sibelius, feeling a newfound patriotic fervor, wrote a suite entitled Press Celebration Music, specifically to protest the suspension of a Finnish newspaper. The final movement, Finland Awakes, would soon, with minor revisions, become what we know now as Finlandia. Now, in future performances of the piece, the title had to be changed repeatedly to evade the Russian censors. The first half of the piece is full of patriotic, driving rhythms. It is not a style that people who know Sibelius's later music would even recognize. It is unabashedly tonal, with very little of the rhythmic instability and even strangeness of his later music. Sibelius clearly meant the piece to be understood by as wide an audience as possible. The middle section of the piece could easily be taken from a patriotic tune of someone like Tchaikovsky. And finally, the hymn arrives. It is one of Sibelius's own, and even though I don't have an ounce of Finnish blood, it is a stirring image of beauty, hope, and warmth. In 1939, words were added to Sibelius's original hymn after Russia once again attacked Finland. The words are patriotic to be sure, but surprisingly or not, they lack violence. It is again in Sibelius's image, a hymn full of sadness, but also hope. Finland, behold, thy daylight now is dawning. The thread of night has now been driven away. The skylark calls across the light of morning. The blue of heaven lets it have its way. And now the day the powers of night is scorning. The daylight dawns, O Finland of ours. Finland, arise and raise towards the highest thy head now, crowned with mighty memory. Finland, arise, for to the world thou criest that thou hast thrown off thy slavery. Beneath oppression's yoke thou never liest. Thy mornings come, O Finland of ours. Let's move a little forward in time again to 1910 and to a composer I've mentioned a few times on the show, Ethel Smythe. Smythe was a wonderful composer in her own right, but she is perhaps best known for her short composition, The March of the Women. Smythe was a suffragette, and she wrote The March of the Women in honor of Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the most important suffragettes in world history. In 1903, Pankhurst had founded the Women's Social and Political Union, a group that is credited today as one of the most important in the struggle to get women the vote, not only in the UK where they were based, but in the rest of the world as well. Their tactics were controversial. They included smashing windows of members of parliament who refused to go along with them. And this is important because it will come up later when it comes to the March of the Women. Ethel Smythe joined the WSPU in 1910, giving up music for 2 years to devote herself to this cause. Putting her talents to good use, her piece The March of the Women became the anthem of the women's suffrage movement. In 1912, Smythe was arrested for smashing the window of Lewis Harcourt, a member of Parliament who opposed women's suffrage. She served 2 months in prison, and Sir Thomas Beecham, the great conductor and supporter of Smythe, tells a wonderful story about visiting Smythe in prison. Quote, "I arrived in the main courtyard of the prison to find the noble company of martyrs, marching round it and singing lustily their war chant." He means the March of the Women. While the composer, beaming approbation from an overlooking upper window, beat time in almost Bacchic frenzy with a toothbrush. Returning back to Emmeline Pankhurst, her tactics became more aggressive. She would stage hunger strikes in prison and was often force-fed. She told Smythe later that during the night, not expecting to survive, she would sing the March of the Women to herself. Now, from the hopeful to the purely cynical and dark, let's head to 1933 and Kurt Weill's masterwork, The Seven Deadly Sins. This satirical piece, with a libretto by the great playwright and lyricist Bertolt Brecht, was as naked an expression of leftist ideas and anti-capitalism than almost anything else on my list. Following 2 sisters, both named Anna, who may well be the same person, we watch Anna 1 and Anna 2 leave their home on the Mississippi River and begin a trip to 6 different American cities in order to make enough money to build a new home for their family. There they experience the 7 deadly sins: sloth, pride, wrath, gluttony, lust, greed, and envy. The twist in the story is that Anna 2 experiences these sins and is horrified by them, but is browbeaten, forced, shamed, and humiliated, often by her sister Anna 1, into going along with each of them. Anna 1 acts as the narrator of the whole story, while Anna 2 only interjects at the end of certain movements, mostly as the human side of the 2 sisters, sounding more and more resigned every time. At times, a mock Greek chorus intrudes, playing Anna's family, watching at home, never caring about Anna 2's character, but instead worrying that she might be getting too fat and moral to do what she needs to do, to make money and send it back to the family.
Da ist ein Brief aus Philadelphia. Anna geht es gut, wie verdient jetzt endlich. Sie hat einen Kontrakt.
Just one example of the cynicism in the piece comes in the 5th movement, Lust. Anna 2 falls in love with a poor young man, but a rich man wants her, so Anna 1 insists that she break up with the poor man and go to the rich one. The rich man breaks up with her anyway when he finds out about the affair, and Anna 2 is forced to work in a strip club to make up for the money she lost.
Sie zeigt ihre kleinen weißen Hintern, mehr wert als eine kleine Fabrik. Zeigt ihn gratis den Gaffeln und Straßenkindern der Welt profane Blick.
Now she shows off her little round white fanny, worth twice a little Texas motel. And for nothing, the pool room can stare at Annie as though she'd nothing to sell. That's why most girls don't get rich, for they go wrong when they forget their place. You're not free to buy what you itch for when you've got a good provider you must face.
Ist
Family. Who fights the good fight and all self subdues, wins the palm, gains the crown. Anna 1. It wasn't easy putting that in order, saying goodbye to young Fernando. Then back to Edward to apologize. Then the endless nights I heard my sister sobbing bitterly and repeating, Anna 2. It's right like this, Anna, but so hard.
Es ist richtig so, Anna. Aber so schwer.
The piece becomes more and more bitter and resigned. By the end, Anna 1 is nearly screaming that she envies the people who, quote, of those who pass the time at their ease and in comfort, those too proud to be bought, of those whose wrath is kindled by injustice, those who act upon their impulses happily, lovers true to their loved ones, and those who take what they need without shame. She has been unwittingly forced to participate in this capitalistic system that has resulted in her ending up as a prostitute.
Sie aber stehen noch schreckliche Wunde, zitternd im Nichts, zitternd im Nichts, zitternd im Nichts, so verschlossene
Weil's piece was premiered in Paris and is a great example of the swirling communist, socialist, and generally left-wing anti-capitalist politics of the German art scene in the late 20s and early 30s. By 1933, though, Weil knew that he could no longer stay in Germany, and ended up, surprisingly enough, in New York, where he became a successful theater and film composer, though he never lost his satirical and sarcastic touch. We now have to head into World War II, where I want to focus on two pieces for their two different points of view on the war. The first is Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. Of course, Shostakovich is someone I've explored many times in the show since his story is so fascinating. And for this show, it was actually hard to choose which piece to focus on, since so much of his music is practically the definition of political music. But I wanted to focus on the Seventh Symphony, and actually one specific part of the Seventh Symphony today, because it's fascinating how a piece can be taken in so many different ways, be appropriated for propaganda, and also be reinterpreted many years after the fact, helped along by the words of the composer himself. What I'm going to focus on today is the invasion theme from the first movement of the symphony. Shostakovich dedicated this symphony to his home city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. At the time of the composition of the symphony, Leningrad was in the midst of a devastating famine caused by a Nazi siege. The siege ended up lasting nearly 2.5 years and resulted in nearly 1.5 million deaths. The winter of 1941 to 1942 saw deaths of 100 to 200,000 people a month. Shostakovich, who had been evacuated against his will from the city just before the blockade, was naturally horrified at the reports from his hometown. As always, accounts differ with Shostakovich over the inspiration of his music, but the Seventh Symphony was initially announced as a bulwark of resistance to the Nazis. It was performed dozens of times in the US, and even though critics hated its supposedly overblown nationalism and scope, the piece was wildly popular. But back to the invasion theme. The invasion theme is a series of 12 variations, based on the simplest of melodies, all accompanied by a snare drum. The variations become more and more aggressive as the music seems to be approaching closer and closer. The terror that this simple theme is able to evoke by the end of the section is harrowing. All over the world, this music was taken as portraying the invading German army. The theme itself has some interesting possible quotations. One supposedly comes from Franz Lehar's The Merry Wives of Windsor, Hitler's favorite operetta, and one scholar has claimed that one specific section of the theme is based on Deutschland über alles, a part of which is the German national anthem. Now, whether or not these quotations are intentional or just coincidences, the banality of the theme and its eventual transformation into grotesque horror is the crux of the matter. For years, even decades, the interpretation of this section was that of the invasion of the German army. But later, an extremely controversial book called Testimony was released, purporting to be Shostakovich's memoirs. In the book, he claimed that the invasion theme in the entire symphony itself had a dual meaning. Shostakovich claimed that the symphony was in fact about, quote, the Leningrad that Stalin destroyed and Hitler merely finished off. Testimony helped to refocus Shostakovich's image. It's hard to believe nowadays, but before the release of the book, Shostakovich's reputation was not that of a silent dissident, but that of a sellout and a stooge of the Soviet Union. The book changed all that, but almost immediately, charges of plagiarism, inaccuracy, and outright lies hounded the book's author, Solomon Volkov. Most of Shostakovich's friends and family now say that while the words in the book are not Shostakovich's, the sentiments expressed in them are his, which seems to be a profoundly appropriate sentiment for a man who was forced to be shrouded in secrecy for nearly his entire life. When we reach the end of the Seventh Symphony, one of the most bombastic and harrowing Shostakovich ever wrote, it's easy to see why people took the symphony as an overblown work of propaganda. Bartók in his Concerto for Orchestra lampooned the invasion theme in a remarkably sarcastic way. But these changing attitudes about Shostakovich allow us to see the invasion theme, the ending of the symphony, and the entire piece in itself in a new light. Shostakovich was repulsed by Stalin and Hitler equally. One friend of Shostakovich said this about the symphony. Quote, and then Shostakovich said meditatively, of course it's about fascism, but music, real music, is never literally tied to a theme. Fascism is not simply National Socialism, and this is music about terror, slavery, and oppression of the spirit. Later, when Shostakovich got used to me and came to trust me, he said openly that the seventh and the fifth as well was not only about fascism, but about our country, and generally about all tyranny and totalitarianism. The other World War II piece I want to mention is Krzysztof Penderecki's Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima. To hear this piece live is harrowing. Penderecki separates 52 string players into individual parts, creating excruciating tone clusters and a feeling of horror that evokes the images of the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima. Penderecki writes for multiple extended techniques, including slapping the instrument, and also asks for varying speeds of vibrato, from none at all to a kind of hyper vibrato. I first heard this piece in concert many years ago and was deeply affected by it, as so many people are. I went home and did some research about the piece and was immediately shocked to find out a significant fact about it. Originally, it had nothing to do with Hiroshima at all. Penderecki titled the piece 8 minutes and 37 seconds, referring only to its length. Penderecki only changed the title after the first performance, saying, quote, "I was struck by the emotional charge of the work. I searched for associations, and in the end, I decided to dedicate it to the Hiroshima victims." I imagine this is a bit of a surprise to some listeners who know this piece, and I wouldn't blame you if it changed your entire orientation towards it. I know it has for me. But it's another example of a piece acquiring meaning only after the fact. I highly doubt 8 minutes and 37 seconds would be performed very much without its new and highly emotional title. With the Hiroshima victims attached, even maybe exploited, it is now one of the most performed and recorded pieces of 20th century music. Whether that's warranted or not is a real question in my mind. A piece that is far more explicit and frankly honest in its motivation is George Crumb's visionary work for string quartet, Black Angels. Black Angels is not a protest piece per se, but it was meant, as Crumb said, quote, as a kind of parable on our troubled contemporary world. The piece was finished in 1970 at the height of the Vietnam War, and was clearly meant to evoke that time period. Black Angels is one of my favorite pieces I'll talk about today, because unlike some of the other pieces on this list, it never directly attacks the thing that it is protesting, but instead evokes the darkness and heaviness of the world at the time. The piece is written for what Crumb calls an electric string quartet. All the instruments are amplified, but also each musician is asked to play multiple other instruments as well. For example, maracas, crystal glasses, tam-tams, cymbals, and more. This, along with the amplification and other extended techniques that the musicians must do on their own instruments, gives the piece its otherworldly and ritualistic atmosphere. The most moving moment to me is Crumb's quotation of Schubert's Death and the Maiden string quartet. The musicians are asked to play with the bow on the tailpiece of the instrument, creating a ghostly sound. The Schubert string quartet that Crumb is quoting is in itself quoting another song, but this was one also by Schubert. The words of the song Death and the Maiden take on a highly poignant meaning when transferred to the days of the Vietnam War. Maiden, pass me by, oh pass me by. Go, fierce man of bones, I am still young. Go, dear, and do not touch me, and do not touch me. Death, give me your hand, you beautiful and tender form. I am a friend and come not to punish. Be of good cheer, I am not fierce. Softly shall you sleep in my arms. There are very few experiences like hearing Black Angels live. It is one of the great pieces of the 20th century, and it absolutely remains relevant to this day. Just 3 more pieces on my list, and since they are about modern issues, they are perhaps both easier and harder to explain. The next piece on my list is not explicitly political again, but it's probably the most controversial piece written in the last 40 years, and has led to protests and disturbances since its premiere. The piece is John Adams' opera, The Death of Klinghoffer. Usually operatic controversies involve new productions of classic operas, but this time the content of Adams' opera, with a libretto or text by Alice Goodman, was the source of the controversy. The opera explores the hijacking of a cruise ship by the Palestine Liberation Front in 1985, which resulted in the murder of Leon Klinghoffer, a wheelchair-bound Jewish American. The facts and the true story presented in the opera are not in dispute, but the controversy lies in a couple of main points. 1. The opera originally began with a chorus entitled Chorus of Exiled Palestinians, and then segued to a chatty conversation between the Klinghoffer family, which many critics described as stereotypical. Adams later removed this scene and substituted a chorus of exiled Jews to pair with the chorus of exiled Palestinians. You can tell very quickly that this opera with that kind of opening is going to be deeply controversial. The second point of controversy, the terrorists who hijacked the boat are given long sections of the opera to explain their views. Accusations of glorifying terrorism and anti-Semitism have dogged the opera since its premiere, with protests coming to a head in 2014, where performances at the Metropolitan Opera in New York were regularly disrupted by protesters. For his part, Adams insists that the opera was never meant to be anti-Semitic. The critic and writer Alex Ross, in a defense of the opera, said, quote, "It is true that the terrorist characters spout hateful slogans. America is one big Jew, one says. But a dramatist cannot address hatred without giving hatred a voice on stage. And the terrorists' words are counterbalanced by the utterances of the victims." On the other hand, the musicologist Richard Cheruskin said this, "If terrorism is to be defeated, world public opinion has to be turned decisively against it. The only way to do that is to focus resolutely on the acts rather than their claimed or conjectured motivations, and to characterize all such acts, whatever their motivation, as crimes. This means no longer romanticizing terrorists as Robin Hoods, and no longer idealizing their deeds as rough poetic justice. If we indulge such notions when we happen to agree or sympathize with the aims, then we have forfeited the moral ground from which any such acts can be convincingly condemned." My advice, it might seem strange, but I think the opera should be seen. These are profoundly complicated questions, and the discussion that takes place afterwards might be more valuable than the opera itself. Clearly, it is an emotional debate way beyond the purview of this show, and which stretches way past the opera house. But to me, the opera remains one of the most fascinating debates of 20th and 21st century classical music, and for that, I'm grateful for it. Obviously, as we get towards more modern issues, the discussion becomes quite a bit more polarized and heated. And in my second to last political piece, we move forward to Hurricane Katrina, which devastated the city of New Orleans in 2005 and caused almost 2,000 deaths, which was unprecedented in modern times for a natural disaster in the United States. Mismanagement of levees designed to protect from flooding and an anemic post-hurricane response from the federal government were blamed for most of the deaths, which created a groundswell of political anger. In classical music, this found its expression in Ted Hearn's Katrina Ballads, a piece that weaves together primary source text from survivors, commentators, politicians, and more, with traditional and non-traditional music, in a bracing and at times disturbing collection of songs.
How do you go about rebuilding? How do you go about rebuilding?
Hearn's hour-long piece is not an easy listen, but it shouldn't be. As Hearn says, quote, "Katrina Ballads is a reflection on our very recent history. I am skeptical of the desire to express concrete ideas through music, but strongly believe in music's ability to bring us closer to an understanding of the way we live. It is my hope that setting primary source texts from the devastating week in 2005 when Katrina hit will help us keep this time active in our memory, challenging us to cut through the spin that followed and bringing us closer to an understanding of the true aftermath." This brings me to my final piece, and for it I actually need to go back in time a little bit to 1975 and the American composer Frederic Chevsky's magnum opus, The People United Will Never Be Defeated. The piece was ostensibly written in honor of the Chilean people's struggle against their dictator Augusto Pinochet, but includes quotations from anti-fascist songs from all over the world. This piece is another masterpiece, like Black Angels, of the avant-garde. The pianist slams the lid of the piano down, whistles, sings, plays inside of the piano, but all of this creates an experience, again like Black Angels, like no other. I remember sitting down in the hall to hear this piece, having no idea what I was in for. I walked out in a daze. The piece is in 36 variations, which makes it a bit difficult to talk about in the remaining couple minutes of the show. And the truth is, someday I'll devote an entire show to this remarkable piece. So I'm going to leave you here with the recommendation to go hear it, at least on YouTube if not live. But just one last note from Chevsky about this piece, which is about unity, about bringing musical styles together, from jazz, classical, minimalism, avant-garde, traditional music, and more. Chevsky said this about the piece, quote, "The basic idea is to unite the people, all kinds of people, against fascism." As I said at the beginning of the show today, if you're American, I hope you're standing in line to vote while listening to this show, or that you have already voted. If not, I hope some of the music you heard today might inspire you to get to the polls before they close. In the meantime, I'll leave you with more of The People United Will Never Be Defeated, with the gratitude that, no matter what happens, this music and this message of a fight against fascism in all of its forms will endure always. Thanks so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you next week, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on iTunes. It really helps the show gain more visibility. And please send any questions you have to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast. I'm also very happy to hear from you for repertoire requests, if you want to hear an interview with an artist, and much more. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.